Здравствуйте! Today we are going to be talking about religion and atheism in the Soviet Union. I'm going to discuss a few different things, such as why Vladimir Lenin was so hell-bent, pun intended, on creating an atheistic state in the first place, and how the leaders that followed him continued to perpetuate these ideas around atheism and religion. Why did they think that atheism was central to a successful socialist society? And more importantly, how does that affect the many, many different religious people in Russia and its former Soviet republics today? So I'd like to get started with a quote from easily one of the most influential figures in Lenin's life. That's, of course, Karl Marx, who said, "Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of soulless conditions. It is the opium of the people." Now, Lenin echoed this sentiment throughout his leadership as he sought to push Russia into an era of atheism, in large part to create a socialist utopia that was not only rid of its Tsarist past, but rid of the religious institution that upheld it. It's important to understand that the Russian Orthodox Church was the dominant religious force in Russia and its wider-reaching empire long before the Bolshevik Party was even conceived. Very closely intertwined with the Tsars, the ROC wielded enormous power, though importantly, the ROC's political influence does far predate its imperial era. From the Christianization of Kievan Rus by Vladimir the Great in 988 to Moscow's moniker of Third Rome, the chaos that accompanied the Raskol, a period of serious religious upheaval in the 17th century over some changes to Orthodox sacraments, and the divine destination of the Tsar dynasty itself, Orthodoxy had been central to Russian society for nearly 1,000 years by the time the Soviets came along. Here in this picture, we can see the last Tsar of Russia, Nicholas II, and his coronation, which contrasts very nicely with the iconography on the inner walls of the church where his coronation is taking place. Now, pre-revolution, the ROC did not take heresy lightly. They enacted campaigns to quell dissenters, such as the Doukhobors, which were a fundamentalist Christian sect that they deemed heretic and exiled to the far reaches of the Caucasus, Siberia, and even Canada. By the time of the First World War, the Russian Empire had over 60 Russian Orthodox dioceses that contained over 77,000 churches and chapels that were serviced by 113,000 clergymen. Now, it's not to say that Russia lacked other significant religious populations within its already incredibly diverse cultural, linguistic, and ethnic boundaries. Not at all. Only that orthodoxy held supreme power as both a religious and a political institution. This institutional power is the precise reason that Lenin and the Greater Bolshevik Party drove forward such a strong philosophy of atheism. In their eyes, the ROC was merely an extension of an inherently evil regime with a perverse, deviant grip on the working class. The execution of the Romanov family and a brutal 5-year-long civil war propelled the Bolsheviks to power, and their idea of a new state began to quickly take shape. To be a believer of any kind, but especially of the ROC, was no longer seen as pious and virtuous, but rather archaic and naive. While the severity of religious persecution did fluctuate throughout the Soviet era, one underlying factor was absolute. Religion doesn't have a place in a prosperous communist society, at least according to the Soviets. Thus, the Soviet era began with sweeping policy changes and brutal crackdowns on religion and its place in public life. But to what end? What lasting impacts would the Soviet approach to religion have on its incredibly varied, multi-faith population, a considerable number of whom were devout Orthodox Christians? Shortly after the October Revolution, the Bolsheviks completely overhauled the education system, eliminating theological schools, introducing atheist narratives to the curriculum, and eventually bringing forth a new type of education known as the Pokrovsky School. The Pokrovsky School focused heavily on the colonialist exploitative practices of the Russian Empire, which really kind of helped push forward this idea that the Russian Empire and its ideological accessories, aka the ROC, were very bad, and communism and its ideological accessories, atheism, were good. In his chapter on Stalinism in the Cambridge History of Russia, David Shearer points out Soviet authorities regarded education as a primary weapon in the struggle against what they considered backwardness, especially against traditional influences of religion and indigenous ethnic culture. The shaping of education was also a priority outside the classroom. In Central Asia, where a large number of Muslim communities existed, religious women in particular were seen as backward and of low political consciousness, with the potential to undermine the state's anti-religious endeavors due to their important role in influencing and educating the children of their communities. Beyond changes to the education system, religious restriction can also be seen in much more obvious contexts, such as Lenin's solution of forced labor, mass executions, and church raids to significantly curb the number of active ROC clergy members, whom he described as the Black Hundreds. In his correspondence with the Politburo, Lenin details that he has come to, quote-unquote, the indisputable conclusion that we must precisely now smash the Black Hundreds clergy most decisively and ruthlessly, and put down all resistance with such brutality that they will not forget it for several decades. Following his rise to power, Lenin delivered on his promise with a severe liquidation of the ROC. Relics were confiscated and popular clergymen were removed from their communities or eliminated entirely, while the destruction of religious property became accepted and even encouraged. Most famously, the Cathedral of Christ the Savior, a cultural centerpiece of Christian observance in Moscow, was exploded and eventually repurposed as a public swimming pool, while St. Petersburg's largest church, St. Isaac's, was desecrated and recycled into an anti-religious museum. Meanwhile, anti-religious propaganda that supported the Soviet idea of the new man began to quickly emerge. While the ROC and its Black Hundreds were the most obvious target, many other religious groups faced persecution throughout the Soviet era. For example, Lenin met his fair share of resistance from the Basmachestvo, a Central Asian collective that aimed to preserve religious practices and traditions. Later, Stalin, Malenkov, and others planned a mass deportation of Jews with the hope that half would die en route. And that's not even to mention the tens of thousands of Muslim clergy and other clergy that were repressed during the Great Purge, and countless others throughout the Union that suffered or perished on religious grounds. Not at all limited to followers of Abraham, more than 100 Buddhist temples that existed across Buryatia were all closed by 1940, with all of the region's religious leaders executed or exiled. Eventually, Khrushchev introduced even more religious restrictions as part of his return to Lenin's militant approach to the Soviet cause. Later, Brezhnev's religious meddling and invasion of Afghanistan prompted even more fierce resistance and is regarded as the single most disastrous decision of Brezhnev leadership. The Soviet approach to religion also entailed other persuasive agendas to help shape public perception. Anti-religious campaigns bred ridicule of believers, while popular atheist publications such as Bezbozhnik helped encourage a more socialist vision for the future. If we look at the few examples I have on the screen here, on the left-hand side, we see one of the early covers of Bezbozhnik, which clearly depicts the religious figures, the leaders of the different religions, in a horrible light, alluding to capitalism and greed and all sorts of things that the Soviets deemed bad. In the middle, we see a poster that reads, "Religion is poison, save the children," with a young girl reaching for school, reaching for modernity. She symbolizes youth. She's wearing red. She wants to reach and strive for the future where these Soviet ideas really are. Who's pulling her back, though? Who is preventing her from achieving these ends? It's, of course, an old babushka that wants to drag her by her hair back to church and keep her in this old backward age. And these themes really, really permeate well on into the space race. I have an example here on the right of a cosmonaut up in space saying no God over the cute little onion domes of a mosque, an Orthodox church, and the steeple of a Catholic church. So these ideas remained in place throughout the Soviet Union and were all over pop culture. Ultimately, the Soviets believed that religion could not be overwhelmingly present in a society that was going to drive forward the socialist cause. Now, Shearer elaborates on the socialist plight, explaining that the cause of building socialism was greater than the individual, that the individual found self-realization only by denying selfish interests, by dissolving individual will into the will of the collective, and by giving the self completely to the cause of socialism and in the striving for socialism. At the helm of Bezbozhnik and other notable publications was the League of Militant Atheists, a socialist group motivated to eliminate religious influence and inspire what they considered to be a new generation of thinkers. Throughout the Soviet era, the consumption of films, newspapers, books, and art became prime methods of persuasion away from God or gods and toward the cause. All of these factors combined contributed to 70 years of religious restrictions and social engineering, really, throughout Russia and her Soviet republics. Consequently, its effects are still felt long after the collapse in 1991, but not in the way you'd think. Interestingly, such restrictions have only bred more religiosity in the long term. In Russia, studies have pointed to a sort of religious renaissance, with many returning to their spiritual roots, the extreme of which bring forward a new legion of holy warriors and knights of Christ that view their communist past as an era of bloodthirst and evil. This creates a really remarkable parallel because it's not that unlike the Bolsheviks who viewed their imperial past in the same exact light. And how did this make the pendulum swing when it came to religion? It brought this anti-religious philosophy into the fold, while now the pendulum seems to be swinging the opposite direction. It has also been found that between 1991 and 2008, the number of Russians identifying as Orthodox Christians grew from 31 to 71%. Similar trends have also been found in other post-Soviet places such as Ukraine, Moldova, and Lithuania, the latter of which has re-welcomed Roman Catholicism. During the same period, an interest in other religions also increased, while those identifying as atheists decreased at a staggering rate from 61 to 18%. Likewise, Islam has flourished. In 1980, Russia had just 179 mosques, many of which were constructed or at least revived during Gorbachev's famous perestroika. And by 1998, that number rose to 5,500. The Islam-affiliated republics have also maintained and strengthened their Muslim heritage. Conversely, the Kalmyks have reconnected to their spiritual past, reconstructing lost temples and reviving their unique Buddhist identity in the years since their liberation. Importantly, a return to faith does not make the Russian Federation a bastion for religious pluralism and tolerance. It does signify the failure, despite many attempts over multiple generations, to render Russia and the republics atheists, proving that in many respects, religion and ethnic identity cannot be dissected. As Lubomir Hadjip illustrates in Ethnic Politics and Ethnic Conflict in the USSR and post-Soviet states, like language, religion plays a dual role in society. It is, in the first instance, a system of spiritual beliefs with an accompanying code of moral conduct, but from its rituals of worship and sacred scriptures also derives religion's close link with culture, expressed in architecture, art, music, and literature, and hence with national identity. In essence, the post-Soviet people's return to religion isn't a spontaneous curiosity about the divine, but rather an important reclaiming of just one aspect of the many varied cultures that once comprised the Soviet Union.